Hi, I'm Janis Hazel, and I'm sitting in for Dozell Varner on Dialogues with Dozy. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a very interesting and exciting discussion tonight with one of my homeboys here in Detroit, Dennis Boatwright, who is the founding director of the Center for Pan-African Studies, which is a Detroit-based think tank that was established to further the works and spirit of doctors Ronald Walters, and John Henrik Clarke. The Center for Pan-African Studies is an independent, nonpartisan research think tank committed to strengthening the social, cultural, political, and economic positions of people of African descent on the continent of Africa and throughout the Black diaspora. In 2008, the works and perspectives of two great Pan-African scholars, Dr. John Henrik Clarke and Dr. Ronald Walters, combined to inspire Dennis Boatwright II to establish the Center for Pan-African Studies. Since that year, Mr. Boatwright has served as the founding director and with unceasing enthusiasm. Welcome, my brother.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for having me
Fantastic.
here.
So we're in Detroit where it's about to get warm. It's trying to get warm. It's what was it, about 45 today? And down there in Florida, where we're broadcasting out of with the expert producer, Toya, we are, they're warm down there, I think.
Oh, yeah.
But we have the water and we absolutely love it. So let's get started. Being that the production actually comes out of Florida, you know, uh, it is amazing that their governor and many of their residents are going along with the whole notion that um, they can erase Black history, right? And African history. So I want to start with your background. What is an Egyptologist?
Thank you, Janice, for that warm introduction. We're actually generous introduction. Egyptologist is an expert who studies the history and culture of Egypt, particularly ancient dynastic Egypt, which we call Kemet. And Egyptologists, their job is to reveal the truth. Some of them are scientists, some of them are archaeologists, some are even have scholarship in genetics. But an Egyptologist is a person, in a nutshell, that studies critically Egyptian or Kemet society and civilization.
All right. And so, why did you choose this field of Egyptology?
Well, Janice, I was somewhat forced into this field of study because I noticed that whoever controlled history really actually controls the world. And I saw that uh, people of African descent has been displayed in unflattering ways, taking them out of Egypt. Just like, in particular, Egyptologists, I realized really the biggest historical fight is over who controls Egypt, who are the people of Egypt. So I decided to get into this battle in order to rescue our people's identity.
All right. And so, for those who have not traveled to the motherland, interestingly, when I lived in Paris, I was in school. And I told you that I was going out with a man. And when I first met him, he's from Egypt. And, we just started going out. And as we started talking about our backgrounds, and, I was there studying. And I said, "Oh, so you're from Africa?" And he vehemently said, "No, I'm from Egypt," as though Egypt was not in Africa. And that had me really messed up because I started questioning my own sense of geography. Because I'm thinking, wait a minute, Egypt is in Africa, it's on the African continent. So, very interestingly, many, I gather, Egyptians do not believe that they're African. Can you explain a little bit about why that might be, or is it the colonialism and the Arabs who want to claim Egypt? Do they have a claim?
Well, great question. Many people, unfortunately, have bought into that propaganda that Egypt is not a part of Africa because their whole claim um, relies on that premise. And they have been promoting this really for millennium since they conquered Egypt. And there is no basis for their claims. But just getting back to them saying Egypt is not a part of Africa, from a political perspective, when you look at the Arabs invaded Egypt in 639 AD. They not only invaded Egypt, they invaded the whole North Africa, or as they call the Maghreb. And what happens is many, not just Egyptians, many Libyans, many Moroccans, many Tunisians don't consider them Africans as we do. They say they're Tunisians. They say they're Libyans. They don't say they're Africans the same way Egyptians say that. When they talk about themselves, they never mention Africa. So this is a part of the propaganda. Now, if you want me, I can go in depth to debunk some of their claims.
I would definitely like for you to do that, because those of us who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the 50s, 40s, 30s, all of those films that were being made in Hollywood, there were European white Caucasians that were playing the character roles of Nefertiti and King Ramsey and all of those films. And that is because of racism in Hollywood. Black actors and actresses were not being used. And so that's why you get an Elizabeth Taylor playing Nefertiti, I believe, in one of her roles, and other white actresses, and they would somewhat darken with makeup their face and body that was exposed. But what are your thoughts there in terms of Europeans claiming Egypt as well?
Well, Europeans want to claim Egypt in particular because of part of their scheme to dominate the world. They have to make you believe you're nothing at all. This is part of the playbook of imperialism, colonialism, and even enslavers. They have to make you believe you haven't done anything, because if Europeans or even Arabs will admit that the original people who founded Egypt before the invasions were black, it actually shatters the whole myth in their propaganda. So it is critical for them to say that anybody other than black people founded ancient Kemet.
What does the DNA say?
Oh, well, the DNA says that we're talking about a method called autosomal DNA analysis or testing. That testing says that we're talking about European scholars, even Hawass, and we'll get to him in a moment. It
Yeah.
says that the ancient Egyptians, we're talking about the people who founded, who built the pyramids. We're talking about, they say, today's people of African descent in sub-Saharan Africa have a 72 to 94% probability or proximity with the ancient Egyptians. Turning that around, it's saying that up to 94% probability that the ancient Egyptians, based upon their DNA, were the same as people of sub-Saharan Africa today.
And I was watching a PBS documentary last night, The Dead, I think it's called The Dead Talk. And they were talking about Homo sapien, lady sapiens. And they talk specifically, all the scientists, about all people originated in Africa, and that the lady sapiens, the women sapiens, the Homo sapiens male, were dark skinned, and they had some reenactments and some uh, I don't know, some figurines that were kind of like kind of like cartoons, if you will, but it showcased the color of the thousands and thousands of years old lady sapiens as well as Homo sapiens, and the carvings on the walls and the figurines that they carved from the tusk of the mammoths back then, and all of the different types of animals, and the ivory tusks. And they had these voluptuous bodies of women, very full bosoms, very rounded and full breast and hips. And yet there was one scientist that was saying, well, this is how they saw themselves. This isn't how they really were. It was a homage to the fertileness of women, because they were exploring, they really didn't understand the connection between sexuality and birth. And so that came later, that they started to understand if you do this, you're going to have that, a baby, right? But it's just interesting how the scientists, on one hand, were saying, yes, the cradle of civilization was in Africa. And then people started moving to other areas. But then they wanted to not acknowledge that these people carved figurines of themselves. They said this is how they envisioned themselves. Now, how does that, what do you think about that?
Well, you know what, Janice, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a important part of something. What I'm going to say is, who were the Egyptians? That's what do they look like? Okay, the first thing that we can do is we could go by Herodotus in 440 BC. When we're talking about 1100 years after Egypt was invaded by the Hyksos, a foreign Southwest Asian group. He described them as dark skin, black dark skin, with woolly hair, skinny and tall, with a love of music and dance. Those how European Greek scholars had described what they were actually looking at. Now, listen to this. Okay, we could go by self-depiction. How did African people depict themselves? Well, if you go into the East, they looked at like this.
Yes.
These are not renditions. These are actual pictures that a artist or a sculptor drew while Pharaoh Djoser in 2600 BC was sitting right in front of them. This is what they look like. And when you look at
depictions, yes.
Look, this is what they said they look like.
Yes. Absolutely.
Here's another picture. This is what they look like before foreigners, Arabs, Hyksos, Persians, British, French, Romans, Greeks. This is what they look like.
Before they cut off their noses from the pyramids, right?
Yeah, it seems like they have a some type of thing against our noses, because we look at all the monuments, those are ones, the first thing that you see disfigured. But that's what the people depicted themselves of during that time.
Very, very, very interesting. I want you to show that picture again, that last that you had.
Well, was it this one or another one?
Yes, it's that one. And let's just kind of go over the facial structure of this person. Now, this is the tomb, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the tomb. So this is how the Egyptians carved and created that tomb in memory or in memorial to which pharaoh? Which one was this?
Well, he was one of the high priests in the 4th century, and during the 3rd dynasty.
Okay, and so we see the broad nose, we see the full lips, right? The facial structure, and yet I think you had a picture that you were showing of what we've been told that the Egyptians look like. the lighter complexion. I mean, even the way that they darkened, I don't know what they were using, clay. I don't know what their materials were, but right, right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to see if our producer can pull up the website of the Tut mummy, and then we're going to move over and start talking a bit about Zahi, Zawas. Okay.
Oh yeah, I can't wait.
So, talk a little bit about this image. What are we looking at here? This is King Tut, and this the actual tomb of King Tut on the left-hand side of the screen?
Yes, yes, we have other even more revealing pictures of that. And the picture that you see is actually a European fantasy, whereas they changed up the phenotype of the person's face to look more European. That's not the actual picture. This is a fantasy of theirs that they're propagating to our people.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's amazing. Now, I did have an opportunity back in the 80s to go to Egypt, and that is what was shown there. So the people of Egypt, do they have control over those pyramids and artifacts and how they're displayed? Do they have to sign off on disclosures, or how are you going to use it? Any photos that they take? Because in your view, who would have created that image that we saw there that had a very European look?
Well, when Arabs, people of Middle Eastern descent, especially Northern Africa, as they call themselves from Northern Africa, when they come to the United States, they mark themselves as white, and they consider themselves white people. So we have to keep that in mind. But the Arab Egyptian government has full control of access of these sites, and they are very particular on who go there to excavate. Just to give you an example of the thousands of licenses they have given people, scientists, to excavate, they only gave two to people of African descent. So it's very um, controlled, because they don't want people like you or myself going there to dig up even more information. So they control the narrative the same way, like, the white supremacist movement in here in Florida, just trying to distort our history. And the
Mm-hmm.
people, the Egyptians, are doing the same thing. They're actually controlling everything to the point whereas they are banning. I have talked to scholars personally, and I'm not going to say their names now because they still have to go over there. They have been harassed to the point that some of them had to reschedule their conferences here in Detroit because they felt that their lives were in danger, just because they were showing facts that the original ancient Egyptians were people that looked like us. And I just say this, Janis, even recently, last month, a comedian of all people, Kevin Hart, was denied access to Egypt. He had to cancel his show
Mm.
after. We talking about Kevin Hart last month. The Egyptians canceled his performance there just because he had said casually that the people who founded ancient Egypt were black. So he can't come over there no more. So now recently there has been intensified attack on our culture.
Amazing. Let's get to Zahi Hawass, who was an Egyptian archaeologist, Egyptologist, and former minister of the state for antiquities affairs in Egypt. Let's talk about who is he and what type of control or power does he have over people visiting there, providing tours to people from all around the country, or all around the world, and his movement or desire to erase African history and culture?
Great question. Hawass is, just give you an example. Hawass to the Egyptian people, in terms of their scholars, is like Ronald Reagan is to conservatives today, the Republican Party. He
Mm.
is the go-to guy. He is the architect of the anti-black movement. In other words, you have to go through him, and whatever he says is considered almost divine. And he has inspired many groups, because it's not just Hawass. He has inspired many groups to pop up and to try to do the work that he's doing, because he's 75 years old. So he is very important. And I'm going to tell you this, he is so significant at his guild that he has convinced President Obama to allow him to be the tour guide in
Mm.
Egypt. Obama went to Egypt as using him as a tour guide. The same way with Will Smith, the same way with Angelina Jolie. He is the go-to guy. So I'm saying this to say, a lot of our children, a lot of our people, if they see some popular or some celebrity people of African descent using him as a tour guide, it gives legitimacy to his arguments. So this makes Hawass all the more dangerous. This is why, he's coming to Detroit he's coming to the United States on a 23 city tour. And one of the places, I know you're familiar, you're from Detroit. You remember the Cobo Hall?
Oh yes, it was renamed within the last couple of
Huntington
years,
Place.
exactly, because let's tell the people who are not from Detroit about Albert Cobo, former mayor of Detroit. When he was campaigning in the 1940s and 50s, he campaigned on a platform of Negro removal. Okay. Now, my birth certificate, Dennis is a little younger than I am, but my birth certificate from Women's Hutzel Hospital here in Detroit says I'm a Negro. Now, interestingly, my father is African American and my mother is Black. So, what does that make me, colored? But it's interesting the different ways that we were called. My parents were born in the 1930s in southern states. So one's an African American in North Carolina, the other is Black in Alabama. And then here I am in Detroit, and I am Negro. So it's all of these things. But let's talk about that tour before we have to go to a break. It's going to be held, and thank you, Madam Producer, an evening with Dr. Zahi Hawass, and he's going to be coming to Detroit. Do you know the exact date for his Detroit tour? Not that we're
Yes.
promoting it, but then I want you to tell me what you've got in store for him.
Well, yeah, he'll be in Detroit May the 26th at Huntington Place at 6 p.m. And what we have for him, we have somewhat of a protest. We have scholars that can go inside during a Q&A session and ask tough questions. And hopefully he will answer them. And we have one of the scholars going to re-record it. So people like yourself, Janis, and others can see the absurdity of his responses. Secondly, we're going to have people, because I tell you that it's really not about a Hawass. Hawass is, like, I would say, he's something of a charlatan, to put it mildly. He's something of a charlatan, and he has no credibility with people like you and I. But other people who are not familiar with Egyptology or even history or even politics, he's a threat to them. But we're going to have some 8x10 flashcards printed with the faces like these. And the other pictures I show, and we're going to have faces of how the Egyptians depicted themselves, front and back in color, with the 13 points that Sheikh Anta Diop presented to UNESCO to prove that the original people of ancient Egypt were people of African descent that was dark skinned and looked like us.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing that we're going to do. And we're going to hand the extra ones that we have. We're going to hand those out to people at Wayne State University, some of the African-American students down there, so that they can know what's going on. And lastly, we're going to have posters blew up of some of the pictures of what the original ancient Egyptians looked like. We're talking about big posters. We're going to show that so the whole world can know really the truth. And we want this, and I received some calls from people out of New York stating that they want to make this a national thing because Hawass and his potential for spreading his deceit is so enormous that it has to be a collective action. And I'm hoping that this issue is one issue that can unite us for some cause.
Now, being that Hawass is an archaeologist and Egyptologist like yourself, and the former Minister of State for Antiquities Affairs in Egypt, is this the way that the government there is going? Are they in lockstep with Hawass about the true history and archaeology of the Egyptians and their phenotype, as you mentioned?
Yes, they're in lockstep with Egypt, because some of the people who have been there in the last couple of years saying that some of the things, the obstructions that they have to face, it has to be a bigger conspiracy. It can't just be Zahi Hawass himself. He is like the advisor to them, because he's the one that is raising alarm bells about calling Pan-Africanists and people who teach Black studies. He's calling us troublemakers. So he is the one that has raised the alarm bells about us, and he is the one that garnered the support of the Egyptian government, because Hawass is not the one that's denying visas. It's the Egyptian government.
Okay. Well, before we go to break, let's talk a bit about what is Pan-Africanism. If someone just happened upon this channel and may not be aware, what is Pan-Africanism?
Pan-Africanism is a political philosophy that sees people of African descent as one unit, regardless if they live on the continent of Africa, the West Indies, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia. We consider them as one. And as a political manifestation of Pan-Africanism, it is the idea that we want to try to link people of African descent economically, politically, culturally, so that we as a collective people can further our interests together.
All right. And diaspora, break that down. What is the African diaspora?
The African diaspora are people outside of the African continent that has been dispersed through violence, enslavement, kidnapping, for other political reasons, even sometimes for seeking better economic circumstances.
Okay, and sprinkled around the world, right?
Sprinkled around, correct.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to take a pause for the cause, and we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with our great historian and Egyptologist, Janis Boatwright, from the Center for Pan-African Studies in Detroit, Michigan. All right. Thank you so much. Go Giga, solutions for creators and events to build excellent experiences and monetize fans. That's an absolute thing that we all need. So you can contact them, and we'll give you that information again before we go. Thank you. And we're back with Dennis Boatwright from the Center for Pan African Studies in Detroit. Now, we've just had a rather monumental thing happen this week that we need to talk about. United States Vice President Kamala Harris has been in Africa. She kicked off her week long visit to 3 countries in Africa. Dennis, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, from a political perspective, Kamala Harris is trying to shore up the declining influence that the United States have in Africa. They're losing ground to China, for example. So that's what she's doing to try to shore up their image. And they always going to use a black face in order to do that. But it's just another drive by that Kamala Harris is going to do, just like the rest of them. They do these drive-by things when they feel that their prestige and their hegemony is at stake.
I love the way you use that drive by. So she first went to Ghana, okay? And I've been to Ghana. I have a friend, a sorority sister, who has been an ambassador to a number of nations, Cote d'Ivoire or the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and I think the Congo and Ghana. So I had an opportunity to check things out when she was there. And so they're stating that this summit that was held back in December 2022 was the first tangible outcome of the Biden's administration's newly announced U.S. strategy toward sub-Saharan Africa, which set the scene for the administration to reposition the U.S. as a valuable partner that reaffirms African agency. The summit brought together about 49 African heads of state and resulted in several major commitments from the United States, including a $55 billion pledge to support the African Union's agenda through 2063, the creation of new digital transformations with Africa, the DTA initiative, and an intention to invest over 350 million in financing Africa's digital transformation. Now, the drive-by that our vice president did, my understanding is that there were a number of African American leaders that accompanied her, including some of the heads of the Divine Nine, traditionally Black sororities and fraternities. What are your thoughts on that, given this vice president and this president have said nothing in the United States about Black Americans' agency? That's what this was supposed to be about, Africa's, sub-Saharan Africa's agency. But we have an ask on the table. And in fact, we've had an ask on the table for 34 years, and that's HR 40 and Senate Bill 40, reparations for African Americans. So how is it that our vice president is in Africa, but has not said anything about the establishment? And we do believe, those of us who are fighting for reparations for African Americans, descended of enslaved Africans and Black Americans, why can't we get a discussion? Why can't we get this president and this vice president to talk about it and advise him and all of the Black advisors that the president has had since the beginning of his term? He's had now 3 Black senior advisors: former Congressman Cedric Richmond from New Orleans, Louisiana; Keisha Lance Bottoms, former mayor of Atlanta; and just Monday, well, I guess Saturday, marked the 3rd senior advisor over the Office of Public Engagement, former mayor who is now in that seat. But no one's talking about reparations for African Americans. And I don't know if I said this to you before, Dennis, I worked for Congressman John Conyers, our illustrious congressman, for over 50 years, and I helped to draft the first reparations piece of legislation back in 1989. It was H.R. 3745, and in subsequent congressional sessions, it became H.R. 40 as a nod to the 40 acres and a mule that we never got upon the ending of enslavement. So let's talk about our vice president in Africa, but she's saying nothing, nor is the president, about reparations for African Americans, descendant of Africans, those of our ancestors that went through the castle of no return.
Well, Kamala Harris and those other 9 people or 11 people you described, they're part of a European hegemonic apparatus. So they're
Now
not going to talk about
let's not throw it out there without telling the people what is hegemonic.
Hegemonic means like control and power over something.
Okay.
And they are part of the American empire. And their job is there to not only promote but protect as well as to project and enforce American power. And they often use black faces for that. And I tell you, I'm glad you brought that up. That the HR 40. Now we'll look at this like Dr. John Henry Clarke says. Our oppressors are not going to do anything to lessen the oppression, because if they do, they slowly start losing their own power. So you have to look at it in the context of this. When they're over there, they didn't get nice all of a sudden and start liking us. They feel threatened and worried that they're losing their influence. But you brought up, Janis, you brought up so many different things that was on my mind. And I'm glad you brought it up so I can speak about it. Here's the thing. They're talking about giving all this money to Africa, all of this money to Africa. When we have to ask them, when did this change of heart occur? Secondly, I've been wanting to talk about it, and I might talk about it at another occasion. Did you know that the Congress, I'm gonna put it on the floor, the Congressional Black Caucus, a few months ago submitted HR 7311, which gives the United States the power to punish, reprimand any country or individual that takes on a neutral role in the U.S. Russia-Ukraine conflict, which means in plain English, what it really means, they can assassinate, they can put Africa on sanctions, and they also emphasize that if any African nation bought some oil from Russia at a lower price per barrel than what the U.S. or the European nations are selling it, they're going to be held accountable for it. And Gregory Meeks, Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York, he the one drafted and submitted and is championed that resolution. So I find it hypocritical, no matter what they're saying, in face of all of this money that they say they're going to give to Africa, yet they're trying their best to pass House Resolution 7311 that gives them a right to punish, which means assassinate, exile, embargo any African country or person. So these people that's going there, they're just the spokesperson of European hegemony. That's all it is. So we, no matter what color, we can't get caught up on that, because I'm gonna tell you this. Sometimes 80% of the administration during colonialism, unfortunately, look like you and I. So it's always going to be a black person who has no conscience that is willing to work against the interests of his own people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here we are. Thank you for bringing this up, Madam Producer.
Yep,
HR 7311, countering malign Russian activities in Africa Act. Everybody, this is public information. You can Google it, or whatever your browse search engine is. HR 7311, Countering Malign Russian Activities Act. And you can see down here at the bottom, the lower left corner of your screen, Congressman Gregory Meeks is the sponsor of this piece of legislation. But we can't get these members of Congress to rally around reparations for African Americans. Yes, many of them sign on to the bill, but Dennis, it's been 34 years since I helped to write the first Reparations for African Americans Act, which is so incredibly innocuous. It does not expend that much or much political capital to establish a commission to study how reparations could be dispersed, to provide proposals on how reparations could be dispersed to descendants of enslaved African and Black Americans. Yet we're over here, Black members of Congress that are elected largely by Black constituencies, we're over here concerned about maligning Russian Activities Act, but we can't get voted out. We can't even get to the floor of the Congress, HR 40. And this is where we are now, those of us who are pushing for reparations. I was appointed by Detroit City Council 2 months ago to the Detroit Reparations Task Force. So we'll have a year or 18 months to develop proposals for the city of Detroit to atone for the heinous acts of racialized violence that city public officials, meaning police officers, allowed to happen to Black people who were just trying to live or move into a house that they have purchased, such as the McGee family back in 1944, who purchased a house on Seabolt, which we in Detroit know exactly where that is on the west side. How do you tell a person who purchased a house that you can't live in the house because I don't want you living next to me? And this is what the white residents said to the McGee family. And so things like that, the redlining, just so many heinous things that happen in the city of Detroit. People like my father, who came back from the Korean War as an honorably discharged veteran, could not partake in the Veterans Administration funding package to help veterans buy houses. But we prevailed. He was able to buy a house, but not with the assistance of HUD, Housing and Urban Development Agency, nor the Veterans Administration funding that helped his counterpart, white soldiers. And so I'm on that task force. We'll be having our first meeting on April 13th, and we'll be moving forward from there with ideas and research. We may call you or people like you, historians, to come in and talk with us. Let's move now to this movement in the United States to erase Black history and Black culture. Now we're talking about the erasure of African culture. Let's talk about what's hitting home right now. Madam Producer, if you could pull up that clip from MSNBC, Alex Wagner, that would be great.
The New York Times reports today that in an effort to get a social studies textbook approved for use in the state of Florida, at least one publisher has made significant changes to Rosa Parks' story. The New York Times compared 3 versions of the company's Rosa Parks story meant for first graders: a current lesson used now in Florida, an initial version created for the state textbook review, and a second updated version. In the current lesson on Rosa Parks, racial segregation is clearly explained. Quote, the law said African Americans had to give up their seats on the bus if a white person wanted to sit down. In a second version created for the Florida textbook review, race is mentioned indirectly. Quote, she was told to move to a different seat because of the color of her skin. And the reference to white people is gone. And in the third, updated version, race isn't mentioned at all. Quote, she was told to move to a different seat. She did not. Who knows why Rosa Parks was told to move? Could have been anything.
Now, and we'll go to those slides again, Madam Producer. The current version, let's just take a look at that. Rosa Parks in 1955 broke the law in her city, which was Montgomery, Alabama. The law said African Americans had to give up their seats on the bus if a white person wanted to sit down. She would not give up her seat. The police came and took her to jail. The second version that is under review states Rosa Parks showed courage. One day she rode the bus. She was told to move to a different seat because of the color of her skin. Now let's just talk about how that has changed. It's not the color of her skin with this whole movement of people of color, which I'm not a person of color. I'm Black, right?
Yeah.
Why aren't we saying because she was Black or Negro, whatever you want to call it back then, Mrs. Parks did not move. She did what she believed was right. Okay. No mention of her actual ethnicity or her skin color. Racism in the US is all about skin color. Now let's move to the third, which is updated version, which is under review now by the textbook publisher. Rosa Parks showed courage. One day she rode the bus. She was told to move to a different seat. She did not. She did what she believed was right. Now, Madam Producer, if you could skip to that slide of me and Mrs. Parks. So I, having worked for Congressman John Conyers, worked with Mrs. Rosa Parks. Okay, she worked in the Detroit office of his congressional office and for constituent affairs. And I worked in the Washington office on Capitol Hill. And whenever Mrs. Parks would come to Washington, I was her personal assistant, bodyguard, / anything and everything that she wanted or needed, going to various events. This particular day, she was on Capitol Hill visiting members of Congress. It was on the occasion of her 77th birthday in 1990. So that's me, about 80 pounds ago. And Miss Parks, which was a petite woman, powerful yet petite woman. And she told me of the various heinous, inhumane, uncivilized way that Black people were treated in Alabama and throughout the South and throughout the United States. I mean, let us not forget in the state of Oregon that in their state constitution was Black people shall be beaten in public until they move out of the state. That is what their state constitution had. And it was only revisited or amended within the last, I think, 20 years. Think about that. So I know Mrs. Parks talked about the racism and racist acts. She didn't just get on a bus one day and decide not to move. There was a reason. She was told to move, and by their Jim Crow laws, that because she was Black, not because she was a person of color, she was a Black woman. And Black people have been treated that way since we got to this country. What are your thoughts on the attempt, the banning of books in libraries and schools that mention any history that we know to be true? Because people like Mrs. Parks, I certainly knew my parents. My mother talked about growing up in Alabama and how she was about 10 or 11. Her younger brother was 10 years younger than her. So he was what my mother called an arm baby, a baby that was in my grandmother's arms. My mother was able to walk. My grandmother had a bag of groceries and they sat down on the bus. And a white man got on the bus and stood over my grandmother with 2 children and groceries. And she had to move, get up and move. That, of course, spurred my mother on in later years to become a freedom rider and help to break the chains of racism for you and I, right? And others like ourselves. So let's talk about this erasure of Black history. What are your thoughts about that? And why is it that white families are so concerned about their children being bothered or damaged by knowing that there was white supremacy, and still is, and that curriculums are Euro-centered, and that there is the problem, biggest problem in this country is race?
Well, Janice, I was looking at some of the pictures. You have put a lot of work in for our people, and I'm just glad that I know you. And hopefully that, our relationship can continue for helping our people out. And then you still look young and you still look, in shape. You good. You know, what's really going on is that they say that you cannot enslave, or in our times control, an historically conscious people if they didn't change those textbooks. If they allow those textbooks to be honest, they will gradually lose control over us, because any people, their confidence comes from them knowing what they have accomplished in the past.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, Egypt. In our case, many other things. The Songhai Empire, the Ghanaian Empire, the Malian Empire. They don't want these things to be taught, because it's going to make us powerful and we're going to start holding our head up high. Just to give you an example, this whole thing is about what? They're saying that they don't want us to teach anything that's going to make white kids feel uncomfortable. That practically throws out the window everything. And some of the points that you highlighted in some of the textbooks that they're saying that they want to put out, it's absurd. But just to show you the desperation of these people. But also, you have to realize is, why are they doing that now? Why is DeSantis emboldened? Why is Hawass coming to Detroit, of all places, in New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago, tough Detroit? Why is he coming here? Because he feels that we are vulnerable. We don't have Dr. John Henry Clarke. We don't have Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. We don't have John Connors. We don't have none of these freedom fighters. We don't have Amos Wilson. And the list goes on and on. So they feel that the African American community, from an academic and intellectual perspective, are not as strong. They know that all of these people has transitioned. So they have thought this out. People like Hawass to attack us, because if we can't give ground, because if we allow Hawass and Governor DeSantis narrative, or their view on history, to gain more ascendancy and penetrate our schools, we're going to be slowly taking steps back. So we cannot give up any ground on that. We can't give up any ground. We have to fight them hard. Otherwise, we might as well give up our card as a people, because this is what it's all about. It's about controlling the minds. And I'll tell you this is not a theory. This is not a theoretical or philosophical debate or philosophical action of DeSantis and Hawass. They're actually doing it. DeSantis and his movement to erase or distort our history has been successful so far in 23 states. In 23 states, there has been some form of watering down our history. So he has got momentum. This is why I say we have to straighten our back up as a community in order to fight this. Otherwise, our kids going to be saying that the Egyptians not black, or they're not black themselves.
Yes. Well, I've worked for the Census Bureau on 2 decennial censuses, which is the population count, 2010 to 2020. In Washington, D.C., I ran the 2010 census. Here in Detroit, Michigan, I worked in the 2020 census. And that movement to, there's so many of these categories, check off, there's the race, the construct of race, and, Black or African American, white, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, white, all of that. For me, it's still further trying to drive a wedge between people. And as you were saying, Dennis, so many young people, the Gen Zs, the millennials, they don't have a grounding in that white supremacy. So many of them don't, and they're questioning the watered down history that they are being forced to ingest. We have Mac Anderson joined us, and he says, define reparations for African Americans. Well, Mac, that is what many jurisdictions around the country are trying to do, is with these reparations task force or commission, and even at the federal level, trying to define what that would look like. That's what we're pulling together historic facts and information to find out how we can repair people economically, emotionally. We're talking about people who were run out of their homes, homes that they purchased, worked hard to buy because of racialized terror. And that's from white people who didn't want Black people living near them. Just think about a house in 1944. Let's go back to 1925. Dr. Ossian Sweet, a pediatrician in Detroit, who these are two U.S. Supreme Court verdicts or cases that had to go to the Supreme Court in order for these people to live in the houses that they bought, because white people in the neighborhood didn't want them living there. Dr. Ossian Sweet, white people, a mob of them came in 1925, I believe it was, terrorizing he and his family, throwing bombs and shooting into the house. And Dr. Sweet and his friends who armed themselves shot out a bullet that he shot out, killed a person, a white person. And it had to go all the way to the US Supreme Court to state he was well within his right to defend his house, his home, and his family. The McGee family that bought a house here in Detroit that were told by the neighbors who were white they had to move, that had to go to the US Supreme Court to state that they don't have to move. The state of Michigan's Supreme Court stated, they sided with the white residents and said, 90 days, you got to get out of your house that you paid for. Those are the types of things that we need repair for, those specific families, but so many others. That think about the loss of generational wealth. A house in 1925 that a family owned, bought straight out 100 years later. Think about the wealth that family could have passed down. That's what we're talking about. You hear and you read report after report from the University of Michigan, Poverty Solutions, from Harvard University, from Brookings, from any think tank about the wealth gap. White families have on average 7 times the wealth that Black American families do. Why is that? Well, you got 400 years of uncompensated free labor that undergirds our white counterpart families. So if you aren't paying labor costs, you're able to build and bank money. That's what is going on. So stay tuned, Mac, as Asheville, North Carolina, as Detroit, as San Francisco, as the state of California, as Amherst, Massachusetts, and many other areas throughout the United States move on defining reparations, the harms that were done to Black Americans, and the types of repairs that can be done. That's what that's all about. Well, we are winding down. I think we have about 2 minutes left. I could talk to you all night, Dennis, to learn more. You mentioned Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, professor at Howard University, the ISIS papers. Being in Washington, D.C. in the 80s and 90s, I had the wonderful opportunity to see her speak and talk about race, racism, and injustices. Can you tell our viewers, list off 3 to 5 books that you think every person should read? Definitely every Black person, but every American should read regarding Black history and our accomplishments so that they can be aware.
This is my best part. The philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, the miseducation of the Negro, the destruction of Black civilization by Chancellor Williams, Dr. John Henry Clarke's Africans at the Crossroads, and Malefi Asante's African history book that just was published in 2020.
All right. I have some of those on my bookshelf. So I'm going to go back and, get off of social media, my brothers and sisters, get your children off and read these books to them. Have them read. so that they can learn. I am so glad that you were able to join us tonight, Dennis. This is Dennis Boatwright. He is the founder and director of the Center for Pan-African Studies in Detroit, Michigan. And we have one question before we leave. Bernard Mason, North Florida, they're trying to make it illegal to teach true history. If successful, kids won't even know why what we are owed. I guess that's what he's saying. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And we, Bernard, Mac, and others, we need to press on. And let us not just leave it up to the school systems and teachers to teach about the contribution of Black Americans to this country. That should be going on in our homes as well. And there's some wonderful books that break it down for young children, for readers that are 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 10, 15 years old. Get those books. Go to the library, online, buy them, add those to, Dennis, I'm a little older than you are. I grew up with the Encyclopedia Britannica. There was no Google. And that's what we learned from. We were watching that. There were only 4 or 5 TV stations. We were reading. And I hope that parents will go back to reading. This is the last slide. One thing I want to leave us with. Where there is segregation, and I'm going to add racism. These are posters from back in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s. White only, colored only, restrooms, drinking fountain, doors of entry. Where there is segregation and racism, there's no democracy, right? And there it is. That's the one. The presence of segregation is the absence of democracy. And they were fighting against Jim Crow, but now we have a backlash of erasing our history, which is all of our history. So go out there, get you some books, get your children involved in reading the history, and we will come back at another time. I believe Dozell might want to have you back when he's back in the saddle. Dennis, thank you so much to our wonderful producer. And Go Giga, remember, check them out, gogiga.com, I believe, solutions for creators and events to build excellent experiences and monetize fans. Go to Go Giga. We will see you next Monday at 8 p.m. And you can pull this video back up on YouTube and Facebook Live so you can remember those books that Dennis rattled off to you. Take care and spread love and be kind to everyone.